All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. My name is James Bress, and I lead the North America Advanced DevOps Center from our Accenture's Tampa Advanced Technology location. Looking forward to 2021 and making our community better this year. We put this group together to share all things DevOps and see the latest in this space. And we're always looking for speakers. If you're interested, drop me a note. Or if there's just any topics, also just drop me a note. This will be a recorded event and posted on YouTube. Some quick guidelines. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question. We encourage video as it helps make the event more socially and engaging. And in the end, we'll open it up for questions, but feel free to ask questions along the way. Just unmute yourself, and then after you're done asking a question or the dialogue, go ahead and mute back. This is just to help kind of keep the noise down for our guests and to make the speaking go smoothly. Going into 2021 is going to continue to be security is going to be the most important topic in technology. And in today's session, Mike Frazier is going to talk about automate CI/CS benchmark assessment using DevSecOps in pipelines. With that being said, I want to introduce Mike Frazier and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, James. And I presented here before, was it last year, like middle last year? So thanks for having me again. And I also, although this is going out of recording, but I'll just say that with Tampa Bay, I got accepted, or my company, Refactor, got accepted into a up and coming cyber accelerator out of Tampa Bay. I can't say any more about it till next week, but so it seems that I'm always coming back to Tampa, whether you're like, hey, Mike, can you speak, or something else happens. A lot of awesome stuff going on in the Tampa area. So
well, what the best place to be, right?
Yeah. Although I don't know when I'll be visiting again. So I hail from Seattle, Washington, which is the exact opposite weather of Tampa. Although today is sunny, so I'll give it that. So I'll give a little bit of my background. So I'm ex-Air Force. I worked on weapon systems on fighter aircraft, F-15s, and I also was a cybersecurity engineer. And I'm that weird anomaly that started as a cybersecurity practitioner and came over to the software engineering world. So 2019, I ended up finishing my master's in computer science at Seattle University using my GI Bill literally a month before it expired. And I also teach from time to time at the local community college here in Seattle, and I've presented at various different events, including All Day DevOps, which is one of my favorite events out there. If you've never been to it, I would recommend it. And in the spring break edition, I ended up getting selected to be one of the chapters in there, chapter 31. So you can go check it out if you just Google Feedback Loops Volume 2. It's a free electronic download. And I've presented at some other events as well, HashiConf, Red Hat, and so on. So I'm well versed in speaking at various events out there, and have been pushing pretty heavily on DevSecOps. So not everybody probably knows what DevSecOps is, and I have my own opinion on the definition of DevSecOps, because there's a lot of folks out there that believe that DevSecOps is purely AppSec, DAST and SAST scans added into a existing DevOps pipeline. But I look at it more as a holistic approach that is around agile automation that integrates cybersecurity seamlessly into existing agile IT, which can be anything from cloud management platforms to scripts that you build out and want to build them up into a pipeline, and DevOps workflows, anything that's existing out there, usually CI/CD around, GitHub, GitLab, and so on. But it's really a holistic approach and a change in mindset so that security is baked into the process. And DevSecOps really also is about collaboration between development, security, and operations. And there's some dithering there too around DevOps and DevSecOps and so on. So again, more collaborative, more holistic, and really integrating cybersecurity is the key piece of that, of what I define DevSecOps to be. So the other thing is, just a little bit of history on DevSecOps, and we'll segue into what that means around Center for Internet Security and how that can be incorporated into DevSecOps pipelines. But originally, DevOps, as a lot of you probably know, was originally called Agile Infrastructure. It was really about adding infrastructure as code to DevOps. Now that we're modernizing and adding cybersecurity into the process, we're also looking at adding in capabilities that traditionally were never intended to be in a DevOps pipelining process. And CIS is a great example of that. There are different standards and different tools that traditionally can be added into the process, but or can be added into the process, but they really weren't built originally to be added into a pipelining process. And DevSecOps is also about adding Agile security as code to DevOps to ensure that you have an iterative and continuous approach that includes security baked in. And that should be any of the existing tools that your cybersecurity teams are using, and also be it that it needs to be collaborative. There really has to be collaboration. It's not just about giving security visibility. It's really about being also able to integrate their tools to be able to map to what the outcome the organization is looking to accomplish, which a lot of times is around, CIS is something that people use for, compliance purposes, and mapping that to additional frameworks as well. So we have to really think about what that means from a code perspective, what that means from an infrastructure perspective, and then what that means from a tool perspective to add them into your pipelining process. So there's this other term that I've come up with, IT as code, and I love this. This tweet from 2017 around the OSI model, and it's really, everything becomes software defined in every layer of the OSI model. Then it should fit into a pipelining process. That should include infrastructure as code, your security scanning around that. There's a lot of tools coming out there around scanning IAC, whether that's Terraform, CloudFormation, ARM templates, Kubernetes configuration, anything that becomes code needs to be able to be a part of your pipelining process, but you also need to be able to include security into the mix. And then the configuration and security as code. And security as code can be policy, it can be tooling around doing assessments, policy enforcement, everything that you need to ensure that the controls that you're expecting to be in place and being able to continuously look at are a part of it. And so I look at it as being holistic. IT as code, everything underneath that, that you need to be able to, if it becomes software defined, you should be able to put it into a pipelining process. And that's super critical for any organization, and the security piece of it should be baked in. Everybody talks about shift left, and what does that really mean? Shift left is really about getting to as close to the beginning of the build process as possible, but it's no longer just about software delivery anymore. And it's also about software defined things too, such as infrastructure, configuration, security. So you really have to, again, look at everything holistically. As we're modernizing, everything becomes software. It has to fit into a pipeline, and we really have to be thinking about how we're going to accomplish that. So the other piece of DevSecOps overall is that it's very complicated. There's a lot of different moving parts. If you look at, below, there's third-party risk, security, compliance, governance, and so on. And different tools touch different places. And thinking about that from a CIS standpoint, in general, there are ways to incorporate the controls and the benchmarks, depending upon what you're using as an organization, what you're looking to use, how you may map that to other frameworks out there, everything from NIST 853, ISO 2700, or 27,000, I should say. Different frameworks that your organization may be looking at to utilize, and how you can map those controls to and what your benchmark, do your assessments, and even your remediation. And then what are the different tools that you can use that may have some of that logic built into them from a policy standpoint. But at other times you may end up having to create some of the content yourself. And so you really have to think about every step of your pipelining process, and where am I going to incorporate specifically on the CIS side, CIS assessments. And you can do an assessment in a pipeline like this that shows all kinds of different stages in your pipeline that could map to different tools inside the pipeline. So you really have to think about, like, what are you building? Why are you building it? Are you building everything so that it's modular? Can you swap different things out? So if you're needing to run some container scanning software that's going to map to a CIS benchmark, that's great, but you may be doing more traditional infrastructure stuff too. So you may look at OpenSCAP or Syscat Assessor or various other tools out there that can help you scan against the benchmarks that give you the assessments that you're looking for. And that's really critical as you're continuing to build and iterate on different pipelines you have too, because it's essential that you are continually looking at how to improve your security posture. And the other piece to that is security touches everything. So we have to think about that from a standpoint of, am I using CIS controls matrix 7.1? Am I using Cloud Security Alliance's cloud or their matrix? Are you doing, like I said, NIST or ISO, or like what are you using there? And a lot of organizations will use CIS benchmarks as the baseline to be able to run tools against those benchmarks, that then they can map those controls over to the framework that you're looking to utilize for whatever compliance requirements that you have. And again, each one of different tools will be able to do different things depending on the different types of security tools that you're using and incorporating in. And you also have to think about now, and this is something that I've seen out there in general, is that everybody thinks about traditional infrastructure as primarily still scanning an OS. And there's some movement towards scanning against, say, the CIS foundational benchmarks for AWS, Azure, GCP. And the key to that is you really have to think about them as two different things. One, scanning your cloud account, the other one scanning against the operating system. And then also, as you're building out your pipelines, can I use particular tools to scan both on-premise and in the public cloud? If I'm doing, if I'm scanning operating systems, if I'm doing more modern stuff like cloud natives, like or Kubernetes, can I use the CIS benchmark against that? Knowing the different layers that you have that you're going to have to be able to scan to from an operating system standpoint, to all the way down into, say, in Kubernetes, the pods and the containers, and thinking about just holistically, how are you going to apply which tools you're going to apply, how you're going to scan against them, and then also future-proofing yourself too, because the tools that you're using now may not be the same tools you're using 2-3 years from now. And so you really want to build everything modularly, and that's really, really important when you're building out pipelines, to really think about the architecture now, but also what you may want to be doing in the future. Do you also want to use open source tools? Do you want to use commercial tools? And there are good reasons for both. And so really it's about a mixture of different open source and third-party tools to really think about how you're going to use those longer term. And a good balance there is what every organization should be looking for. And you can feel free to ask questions too as we go along. So like James said, you can just unmute yourself if you have questions. So I've come up with 4 different principles of DevSecOps. The first one is, a lot of times when it comes to cybersecurity, we're so used to running a tool against something. And so we really want to look at, and I still view that as more a manual process, or doing something by hand. Also from a remediation standpoint, a lot of times, you'll go in, you'll run an assessment, you'll find that you need, a particular control fails, and you want to go in there, or control or a rule, and you want to go in there and update that. And so you go back and make the change by hand and rescan it. And you really want to think about not just the assessment of the whatever you're scanning against, if that's infrastructure or a cloud account, but you also want to think about how you can continuously automate it. So you want to put it in the same agile approach that you do for software delivery. So that way, if something comes up in an assessment, you can go out and automate it too. And it's also critical for business continuity and disaster recovery, so that you also know that if you seat something, that you can unseat it as well. So that way you have some way to continually enforce the security state that you're trying to accomplish, and essentially have the control enforcement that you're looking to achieve. The second one is, instead of manually responding to alerts and events, we create automation that cuts down on labor overhead and human error. And the real key there is, no matter where you're at in DevSecOps, everybody has talent shortage issues. So labor overhead is a no-brainer. But the real key is, can you have a machine do something over and over and over again and cut down on human error? Now, the key there, though, is if it can if it can run automation successfully, it can also run it to fail as well. And so you really want to think about how you're building out your automation. But the key there still is you want to have a continuous process and a continuous feedback loop when you're integrating security, and specifically security tools, into your pipelining process. The third one is, instead of being reactive, we are proactive to use an agile approach for cybersecurity use cases. And we really have to think about that holistically, as I mentioned earlier, because you really want to approach everything that you're doing from a cybersecurity use case as something that can be integrated into an existing process, or you can create a net new process but using the same methodology. And so you really want to think about how you're incorporating that in. And again, CIS is a great example of that, because there's various areas that you can apply CIS controls, CIS benchmarks to various infrastructure and cloud accounts and so on that you're looking to do, or even more holistically, if it's the controls matrix, what's the latest one, 7.1, you may be using that as well. And a lot of organizations use that as a stepping stone to then move into something bigger than that, like NIST or ISO. And then the fourth one is, instead of configuring security manually, we seamlessly integrate cybersecurity into existing agile IT and DevOps workflows. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are moving towards using cloud management platforms, building their own scripts that they're chaining together that they want to then incorporate into some sort of pipelining process. And so really thinking about getting out of just being in a CLI, especially if you're automating from that perspective, and figuring out how you can build more of a pipelining process that can include what you're doing from a CLI standpoint and a tooling standpoint. And a lot of the tools that we use in the cybersecurity world are either GUI or UI based or CLI based. And so we really want to think about how to move those into a more of a pipeline process. And I actually have been working with CIS for over the last year now, and I actually integrated into the platform that I have at Refactor, their Syscat assessor tool. And the goal there was that most organizations would be setting it up by itself. They'd run their scans, but it wasn't integrated into an existing workflow of any kind. And so tools like that are super critical in order to ensure that you can get the continuous piece, but also you want to be able to incorporate that into any sort of pipeline process you have. And again, it may no longer be just about software delivery. You may want to apply a CIS benchmark to your network devices like Palo Alto Networks or Cisco. You may want to apply it to operating systems or the cloud via the foundational benchmarks. You really want to think about that, and it may be moving more towards the security and the ops side that you want to be able to apply controls and benchmarks to. So from a CIS standpoint, really CIS is all about, and again, I've been working with them for a long while now, to be able to make essentially anything that's connected to the internet secure, and being able to help everybody from the enterprise/commercial side to the government side to protect against pervasive cyber threats. And obviously with the recent news around SolarWinds and FireEye and other ones that are popping up now, this is becoming more and more of an issue that's not just a talking point anymore. It's like, how do we solve for this? How do we ensure that we secure, the supply chain of any sort of software that we're incorporating into a process. And we really have to think about that too from a standpoint of incorporating security into a pipelining process that also gives us the ability to know, like, what are we actually incorporating into this pipeline? Do we have checks in place that allow us to make sure that we have the proper controls we need, but also being able to check against various things like third-party libraries and so on. And so from a CIS standpoint, it's really geared around like I said, the controls, which some of them are more around the holistic controls of the organization, like the CIS controls 7.1, and then the benchmarks are about all the different controls that you can apply towards various operating systems, the three major cloud providers, and even other products like network devices, and even different things like Apache or other type of products. So you have a lot of options out there. I think there's over there's hundreds of checks, sometimes depending on the benchmarks, hundreds of different rules per benchmark. They also have a product that I've worked with, which is called Syscat. And the nice thing about Syscat, and I don't know if anybody here has used OpenSCAP, but there are open source tools out there too. But Syscat is actually something they built that have the ability to run against remote devices. You can tie into, whether it's a Linux distro or Windows. You have the ability to tie in from a command line interface. And really, when you're looking at different tools that you want to use for CIS, you really want to look at what's out there. There are other tools like Chef and Spec, which now I think is under Oregon Laboratories in the open source side. And then there's third-party tools out there like Tenable, Nessus, Tenable.io, Qualys, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff out there. The key is, though, what are you trying to accomplish with your CIS scans? And also, a lot of folks have existing, what I call traditional, but more, the on-premise infrastructure that you want to be able to run your CIS benchmark assessments against. And the last thing you want to do is go through the PDF that is available out there, which I will show you right now. Well, it's a good thing to actually read the benchmarks. They're all available for free for anybody that wants to grab them. But I'm just going to change screens. So this is what a benchmark looks like. So there's a PDF, I think there's an Excel version too, but the goal of these are that there are all these different rules and different various sections that cover all the things that you're looking to cover and essentially harden your infrastructure and do your assessments. And the various sections in here, depending on how they're applied, can vary from the different nuances on the different cloud providers and what they cover and they don't. Most of the benchmarks were created with traditional hardware infrastructure, and then those nuances have to be updated when it comes to these benchmarks. But the goal with each one of these sections too is that some of them, like this RHEL 7, have different levels too, so you can apply those. And then in the DoD world, there's also what's called DISA STIGs, and they support, or CIS supports that with the Syscat tool as well. So does OpenSCAP. So you really want to think about the different tools that you're using, and then also the different levels and how you're applying these profiles as well. So you have the ability to enforce different levels of essentially rule enforcement when it comes to the different levels. And then depending on the flavor of the benchmark, you may also have a workspace or a server version too. So think about that. Same thing on the Windows server side. There's multiple levels as well when it comes to that. Any questions so far? Will I switch back? You guys all sound excited.
Yeah, I do have a quick question. Is there any kind of direction when it comes to orchestration for all of these aspects when it comes to DevSecOps?
Yep, I will get into that. So, and when you're talking about orchestration, you just mean like what type of automation tools or platforms can you use in order to do what you're essentially be able to incorporate the tools you're looking for?
Yeah, I think generically, we're all talking about the whole SDLC and then how do you put the second DevSecOps, but then also specifically, I'm looking for cloud projects as well. So when you start talking about cloud providers and how to orchestrate not just your own data centers, but then hybrid and public as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will let me finish here, and then I'll get into that get into that piece of it. But I have a slide here specific around what you should look for a platform that you'd want to use around that for essentially what you're getting at, which is a hybrid approach to building out not just the pipelines, but how and where you can run them as well, which is super critical.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think sometimes people start with the notion of not knowing what's out there. They start on the projects, get to a certain level of automation, then find out there's a whole bunch of orchestration available and integrations, right? So knowing that up front would be really useful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of options out there. And so I think to your point, when we're shifting to DevSecOps, we really want to think about the automation platforms we're using, the team that's using the platform. And again, it may not be specifically the just for, SDLC, right? It may also be, hey, I want to spin up and test, the hardening process with, CIS, and I want to remediate. I want to do an assessment. I'm doing a remediation, and I want to, get an output of what the report is on that before I even attempt to incorporate those secure, those hardened images into my process. That's one example. So you really have to think about the entire life cycle and what the actual process that we're looking for, and also can we do a continuous assessment with whatever product we're looking at, and does that let's say CI/CD platform, does that support the ability to run both on-premise and in the cloud? Because a lot of CI/CD platforms are only cloud-based, and you as an organization may not, you're probably only a certain percentage in cloud, and so you need something that can span between both, on-premise, your own data center, and the public cloud. And then also thinking about it from a stage standpoint. So, can I create and iterate on, my different stages, or apply what I'm looking for from that standpoint? Can I create golden images from a CIS standpoint that I can base everything off? Whether I need golden images to spin up Kubernetes clusters, or I'm just trying to do, RHEL 7, RHEL 8, VM, you'd be able to have a process that you can start off with golden images, and then also be able to have a continuous automation process that can continually re-verify the controls you're having, because every single benchmark has, updates every so often, and you really want to make sure that you're on top of that. And then also you want to be able to provision, then scan, remediate, and then if you need to scan again or do multiple scans before your deployment. Again, this is all about the checking and making sure that you can also have multiple checks in place. I've seen organizations that have multiple tools in place too, which goes back to what you're getting at as well, which you want to look at any pipelining platform you're building pipelines out in. You want to be able to create each one of these as a building block type of approach, so that you have the ability to also decouple your scans, and you can run them both, say against on-premise hardware or cloud hardware. So you really want to think about that. And then you want to think about how you can support multiple platforms. You may have VMware on site. You may be in, one cloud provider. You may be in all three of the major cloud providers. You may be in Oracle or IBM. So you really want to think about how you're creating your pipelining content and how that can be applied, and where you're trying to run that. And that's super critical when you're considering anything in the life cycle of building this out, and how you're going to incorporate the different tools in place. And one of the ones that I've done a lot of work with recently is Syscat Assessor by CIS, which is really something that helps to incorporate the native support of scanning against the CIS benchmarks. But then equally important to that is the remediation content or the baseline content, because it's one thing just to get an assessment, but you want to take it to the next step, which is, okay, great, I have this data. Now I run the remediation against it, or you may even want to remediate first and run the assessment afterwards so that you know what the end result is as you're trying to build your golden images, as we like to call them, or any of your infrastructure. Yeah, and the other thing I would touch on is like the CIS Cloud Foundation benchmarks. Those are great too, but you have to be a little bit more careful about those because you apply those to your cloud accounts. And so you want to make sure that you know how you can roll back things too, because if you end up locking things down before you have certain settings in place, you can cause yourself issues, just like you can do on the golden images, which I always recommend, build out and test and get everything all dialed in first before you decide to roll those golden images to production. So if there are any sort of tweaks or exceptions you need to make, you can build those into your golden image in your pipelining process. So the other thing is, we looked at the stuff that I've been doing at Refactor and with CIS, and this is just generally just thinking about it too from any sort of pipelining process, is you really want to be able to speed up the ability to run, to automate the runs of your CIS assessments, and then also be able to chain that together with any sort of remediation that you're trying to accomplish. So that way the end result is you can have a continuous DevSecOps pipeline that gives you the end result that you're looking for, and then you can incorporate that into other pipelines. So I've seen a lot of organizations where they'll build out their hardened image pipelining process, and then once that's done, they'll incorporate that into other pipelines to make sure that they can start extending and building more of kind of a solution type of approach when it comes to DevSecOps pipelines. And then also figuring out, I may have infrastructure that I want to run in different cloud providers or on premise. I can have that be something separate that I can just incorporate in and chain pipelines together. So it's really about the best practices around, as you're building out DevSecOps pipelines, really figuring out the tools you're using and the content you're building around the tools, which essentially are the pipelines, which is super critical as you're moving forward. And then the content you're using in the pipeline. So you may have remediation content. We built some with Red Hat Ansible to be able to use that with CIS benchmark assessments. So really thinking about the tooling that you're using and you're building out content around, and is it something that you can continue to iterate on as well? And is there an open source community behind it too, which is super important for a lot of these different tools that you'll pick and choose and decide what you want to use that are best for your organization. So the other piece of all this is, we want to put the security in the sec in DevSecOps. And the key with that is we have to be able to integrate existing security tools. So like I said, Syscat Pro was never something that was incorporated in any sort of pipelining process. And it was something that had to be built into a platform in order for it to be able to be utilized in a broader pipelining process. But traditionally, those type of tools were never made for a pipelining process because the platforms were originally made just for devs. And if you want sec to be a part of DevSecOps, you really have to be able to incorporate these various tools into the process, and then live with other tools in the process, like IAC code scanners, like Accurix Terrascan or Bridgecrews Checkoff to scan the IAC even further left in the process. But being able to even get the CIS benchmark assessments incorporated into your infrastructure, your DevSecOps pipeline process with your infrastructure is a shift left that you really is kind of one of those first steps to be able to shift left. And also, can you incorporate security professionals or practitioners into the process too, where it's not just about visibility, but as a DevOps engineer or a DevSecOps engineer or cloud architect, can you build content that you can provide out there to the, your cybersecurity practitioner counterparts that can also use them. And again, a good example of that is like with Syscat Assessor, to be able to build that into the process, because those are tools that traditionally are being used by cybersecurity, but have never been really thought about as being part of a pipelining process. So this was your other question. So there are various CI/CD platforms out there. We've built one, what we call our DevSecOps automation platform at Refactor. There's GitLab, there's Azure DevOps, there's Jenkins. The key with any of them is, can you deploy or run the pipelines you create and the content and the tools both on-premise and in the public cloud? And also, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the assessment content and the remediation content that can be applied too. So with CIS, there's, lots of different benchmarks that you can use, from everything from network devices to operating systems to the cloud providers themselves. And so you have to think about this holistically as you're building out your DevSecOps pipelines is, can I also apply that pipeline to on-premise stuff too? Because that stuff is not, in a lot of organizations, completely going away. You still want to have some pipelining process around that. And I've seen organizations do that where they're automating against network devices, and now they want to apply a CIS benchmark against those devices, but putting it into a pipeline process. And so thinking about this again holistically, you can start thinking about use cases that traditionally wouldn't be considered a software delivery type pipeline that could end up being able to deliver, configuration enforcements of CIS, benchmark remediation. And then also how you're going to apply that to, on the cloud side, do the different platforms have, APIs and CLIs available so you can tie that into your own systems? A lot of organizations have, you have your own internal platforms too, so you want to be able to extend those, and so that's super critical. And the last piece is you want to be able to incorporate everything in from a Git perspective, especially if you're trying to do version control. Again, even if it's not traditionally app development code that you're creating, if you're using infrastructure as code or configuration as code or security as code, you should have all of that stored in Git. And then thinking about that also from a standpoint of other tools that you have around, if you're running CIS. So if you're using something like Syscat Assessor or OpenSCAP or in Chef and Spec, you want to think about those from a standpoint of, I need to use those in conjunction with other things that I'm doing. And if I'm creating the infrastructure first, running the scan against it, or can I decouple that infrastructure from that pipeline and just run the scan by itself too? So you really want to be thinking about that as you're building out your DevSecOps pipelines and how you're going to incorporate those. And then can those tools work both on-premise and in the cloud too? So I've seen a lot of organizations even moving over towards, IAC on-premise around VMware, but standardizing on, say, Terraform, because then they can also use it with AWS and Azure and Google and everything else you're doing in the public cloud. And then looking at different other tools. Do I need to apply configuration to it? Maybe I'm using something like Ansible. Do I want to run a Syscat, Syscat Assessor or OpenSCAP in conjunction with that? So again, thinking about how you're chaining together these different tools and what's the platform you're going to use it on. And I've seen, people build stuff out in all kinds of different platforms, but some of the best out there are, GitLab because they have a community edition or a community edition. They have a open source edition that you can also run on-premise, and then Azure DevOps gives you the ability to run both on-premise, or at least the runner technology, both on-premise, and then obviously everybody's, I'm sure up to this point, has used Jenkins in some capacity. So any questions on that? I like your background, Deborah. I can see a silhouette of you. What is that background? I think you're on mute.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I don't remember which one it is. It was one I picked a while ago.
That's awesome, yeah. You don't have a green screen behind you, so it's green screened you.
Yeah.
That's funny. All right. So moving on. So an example compliance use case really around the infrastructure. Am I creating the infrastructure initially, as I was kind of mentioning? Can that be decoupled? Do I want to, set up a notification and send out a notification using something like Slack message? You can pick up all kinds of different tools, but the key there is being able to chain these different tools together so that you have the ability to get the end result, which is building infrastructure, sending out a notification, running your remediation content. So I've worked a lot on and with various companies out there around building remediation content like MindPoint Group. And it's really critical to be able to leverage open source tools that will give you the end result that you're looking for, that can map to the CIS benchmarks that you're trying to, or that you're running your assessments against. And then, the ability to assess, and you may, depending on the type of pipeline you create, you may do an assessment prior to remediation and after remediation. So it really depends on, what you're trying to accomplish. And, is this going to be a hardened production ready image, or are you just trying to go through the process so you have some reporting so that you can iterate on this too? Are you going to add in exceptions that you may need depending on where this gets deployed? And then at the end, being able to pop that report out into some other system, so you have the ability to get that report, which is critical. And so when you think about that, you really want to be cognizant of the tools that you decide to pick to run for your CIS assessment. There are a lot of tools out there too, or platforms that may have CIS assessments built into them as well. So you can use those two third-party cybersecurity products. The key though is, can you build that product into a pipelining process? And that's super critical, because you want to, again, you don't want this to be a point solution where it's a one-off scan to go do something. You want to be able to build this into a broader pipeline that you can utilize and get the outcome that you're looking for from a pipelining perspective. And then also building it so it's future-proof. So you may end up having the assessment with one tool now, but you may incorporate another tool a year from now, or you may want to have multiple tools. I've seen organizations that want to incorporate 2 or 3 different tools to be able to do the CIS benchmark assessment. So it just really depends on your organization and what you're trying to accomplish when it comes to the CIS benchmark assessments. All right, so who wants to see a little demo of the CIS assessment and remediation in action? All right. All right, so the key is you can build this out, and you can build this in any platform, like I mentioned, GitLab, Azure DevOps, and so on. I'm going to show you a demo of the stuff that I've been working on at Refactor, but the key here is really to think about the pipeline building process and building out the pipeline that can map to the end result that you're looking for. When it comes to creating automation to harden infrastructure, you want to have a starting point of the infrastructure that you're creating from the very beginning. So here we're starting with a CloudFormation template. When it comes to running a Syscat assessment or running a CIS assessment, again, there are multiple options out there. There's also OpenSCAP that's highly used out there, an open source version as well, so you can incorporate that in. A lot of folks also use Chef and Spec as another open source, highly popular product out there as well. But the real key is to think about this more from a standpoint of the ability to chain together pipelines and have the ability to also decouple the pipelines that you create that can be run on their own and can also be applied to or used with other pipelines too, because I may build on AWS with CloudFormation, but I may also want to build with Terraform out of the gate too. And something like CIS, I'm running it against the infrastructure that gets created, so it doesn't care about what you're building it with, and so you can decouple that from the overall pipeline and have it available as something you can add into your pipelining process. The other thing to think about too is the remediation content. So there's all kinds of content out there. I work with a company called MindPoint Group to get open sourced content out there that you can run. So this is the RHEL 7 CIS baseline, essentially, or baselines / remediation content. And so you really want to look at, is there content that I can use out there that I can run from a remediation standpoint? Because assessments are great, which is definitely the first step. But the next step to that is to be able to enforce the rules that you're trying to get the end result to get your overall CIS benchmark score up as high as you possibly can. And so you want to look at that out there. And there's all kinds of different orgs that have content out there. MindPoint Group is one of the most active out there when it comes to the baseline / remediation content, which is out there. So this particular pipeline maps to what I was showing you in that slide deck. So this will create the EC2 instance. It'll run a hardening pipeline that will give you the ability to pull that actual repo that I showed you in. So you want to create different pipelines that you can chain together. So this will pull that pipeline in, write an inventory, and then run this remediation role. And we're passing in some rules that we're overriding, since I use this for demo purposes, so we can actually run this again against the machine, because traditionally you would lock down particular roles that would make the device inaccessible unless you're on a internal network or a VPN. But the goal there is that you want to think about how you're going to run the remediation against it, and then do you have any exceptions that you need to allow? A lot of times you need to have exceptions that you'll need to allow as well. Something like locking down SSH, you may have to have SSH available if you use a tool like Ansible to be able to run against the box. So you can put exceptions in place for yourself, but you want to make sure you document them and have them jotted down, especially if you skip those, if you're trying to get a particular score, or trying to increase your score, I should say, when it comes to the SysCat assessment. And then the CIS or SysCat assessor in general. So like I said, I've worked with CIS over the last year plus, and we integrated SysCat assessor into the Refactor platform. And the goal there, though, was to be able to have it so you could utilize that particular tool inside of a pipelining process, because it's super critical to be able to leverage tools in there. And a lot of times it's a heavy lift when it comes to incorporating particular tools into a pipelining process, especially if they've never been built in before. And so you really want to look at various platforms out there that have the capability, not just from like the core tools you're looking for, but also the security tools that are super essential to be able to add in. And SysCat Assessor is one of those tools. Again, a lot of folks will use OpenSCAP scanner, but it's a beast of a product to try to get up and running yourself. And even when you do, there are some limitations on how you can run this against remote systems and so on. So when you're looking for a tool, you want to make sure that it can support running against, being able to authenticate via SSH or WinRM on the Windows side. And so you can do it remotely without having to have an installer, on every single device that you're trying to run it against. And then here we actually are taking the output of this, which is the report, and popping it into a Slack message. So if I go into this builder, you'll see here, this actually will run the assessor, write the SSH key out, so you can authenticate against it, use it with this assessor to authenticate. And then SysCat actually has a session file that essentially you tell it what kind of connection, the information you need to be able to authenticate against it, which is critical. And so you always want to think about how you're going to authenticate when you're running any of these tools and how they can run against the remote machine. And again, if you can use what say the OS already has from authentication mechanism, you don't have to install anything on it, then this could be something you can use for both, a cloud OS and on-premise as well. And so this can be run completely on its own without having any dependency of having to run it against, say, some infrastructure you have to create, because you could run this by just supplying the IP address here and the credentials. And then here we're actually writing out a report URL and a message. So when this runs, when Syscat runs, there's some options where you can do report formats in HTML, CSV, TXT, and then you can also do a JSON object. And so when you're looking at tools, the output is very critical, not just from a report standpoint, but you also want to look at, can I get here, we actually worked with CIS to build this in, the non-passing rule results, which is, can I get a list of results that I then can use in the remediation content that I'm going to run as well, which is super critical if you're trying to do this continually, where you want to be able to constantly, hey, I may want to put this on a schedule. And also I may want to, if a new benchmark comes out with some updates to it, I'll want to be able to incorporate those too, which you can do from a benchmark perspective, and you can also do from a an output perspective on what you can pass from this assessor into another pipeline that you can then utilize for remediation. So you want to look for tools that give you a lot of flexibility on the CIS side, and also in a structured data, a universal structured data way like JSON, where then I can parse out what I need from that and use it in a subsequent pipeline. And then the last, as I said, dropping in that Slack message. So I'll run this so you can see Syscat run, so you'll know what that looks like. 1 second. And you really want to think about, the different variables that you set up for inputs, depending upon how you're creating this, trying to abstract out so that if I want to incorporate a different benchmark into the Syscat assessor, I can. So that way, if whether I want to run it against RHEL 7, RHEL 8, Ubuntu, different flavors of Linux, you could even do more abstraction and have it usable for different operating systems too. So you want to think about that. And then when we run Syscat assessor, it'll give you a full output and give you like every single rule and if it passed or didn't pass. And then also on the remediation content side, it's really critical to see the Ansible output. And you could do all this from command line testing things out first, but the goal is that then you can get it into your pipelining process, because you want this to be continuous. You want to be able to put this on a schedule, or another option is manual. I like to call it manual automation, where you have somebody run the pipeline, but they do it by hand. And you want to think about so here's all of the different in Ansible running the different rules on the remediation side, and then this will run the assessor after that, which will then give us an assessment and stream this out from the standard out, so you'll get a full output of all this as well. The one thing I'll say about Syscat Assessor Tool is it has a really, really good CLI. So there's a lot of different options that you can utilize, and so you can run this on your own too, by hand from a CLI. There's also a UI as well. Again, when you're looking at different tools, you want to make sure, does it have a dashboard? Can I compare diffs between different benchmark assessments so I can look for configuration drift? What are all the different things that I can look at from a standpoint of what makes sense from an assessment standpoint, and then again the remediation piece too. So I don't want to just do the assessment. I also want to continue it on to be able to run the remediation, and I may want to run it first and then run the assessment against it to verify that the remediation is working. But the key would be to make this configurable so you can determine where you want to do your assessments too. I've seen people do 2 or 3, running a Syscat assessment inside of the process, depending upon what they're trying to achieve. So here, this actually will give you the the output, and we'll show you the machine that this ran against. Here, this authenticated via SSH. I just got the Slack message, which is a link, and I'll pop that here in a second. And then down here, we have our score and the different assessment results that we have. And you also notice here, like total not checked. So you can, again, skip certain ones if you need to override. And then if you're doing an audit, you can have, an explanation for your exception of why you had to not check it or override it, and go from there. And then also seeing which ones failed as well. So you can remediate those as well. 92.26 is a very high score. I'd love to see 100 there, but anything over like 85, 90 is in the ballpark of what you're trying to achieve when you're trying to run, which I guess in the real world, that's a B to I guess an A minus, an A. So, all right, let me show the report too, that just came from that. So this is what the report looks like, specifically from Syscat. So you'll be able to see the different failures on here, what passed in what category. So when I showed you this this benchmark before, it structures it all so you can see each one of the sections. So when you're looking through this, you can see each one of these, and you can click on a link and go to it. And then it'll give you all of the different passes and fails that you want. And then depending upon, do you also want to just pop this out in a different format and pop it into your SIM or some other system as well, so you have full capabilities of doing that. So you really want to make sure whatever you use for CIS benchmark assessments, that it has the ability to be super flexible on where you want to put this data as well, because you probably have something else that you do for a reporting standpoint or dashboarding or whatever, like a SIM like Splunk or so on. All right, well, I think I'm close to time, James, or right around.
Yeah, we are definitely, we're there. We're about where I'd say we're probably right on time. We started about 5 minutes late and kind of ran this about an hour. We're really great presentation, by the way. I really appreciate you doing this for us. And thanks for folks that are attending, of course, as well.